Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the Disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the Disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the Disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. We have a smaller crowd today. Maybe the cheap seats will drift in. Want to tie up, begin by, this is called alphabet soup, because we're going to talk about how the disciples of Christ are organized. And there's just lots of things that are initials. And just going to try to tell you about how the disciples are organized locally, regionally, and nationally. But there's a loose end I have to tie up from last week. There's one organization I failed to talk about, DHF, Disciple Heritage Fellowship. This is basically a group of Disciples of Christ churches who got mad that we were too liberal and left. They're not independent Christian churches because they're progressive enough. They have female pastors. They may have open membership. That they don't want to be independents, but they don't want to be us. But what's interesting is you get on their website, and they call themselves Disciple Heritage. I think there's an E in there, which you would think would be staying with the old ways of disciple. But the first thing you see on their website, how you've got the things you can click at the top, are beliefs. They have a statement of faith. Now, what's another name for a statement of faith? A creed. And it's like, okay, how do you are you having your cake and eating it both? How can you be true to disciple traditions and have a statement of faith? Which is just, I thought, kind of funny. Anyway, again, we're going to try to sort out alphabet soup-wise. All these organizations are confusing. We're the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And then we have the non-instrumental Church of Christ. And then we have the in-between group, what we sometimes derogatorily call the independent Christian churches. But they call themselves the CCCC, Christian Churches and Churches of Christ, which makes us all clear as mud. But what's even more interesting, if you go to some of the old disciple churches in the East, sometimes they'll still say Church of Christ, because at one time that was how we described ourselves. The church I pastored in Hiawatha, for one of our, I think it was our 110th anniversary celebration, we got our articles of incorporation and framed them, and we called ourselves the Church of Christ in Hiawatha. Well, yeah, there is a Church of Christ in Hiawatha today, but it was not meeting in that building. But it's confusing. And then the one other thing people get confused with is the UCC, the United Church of Christ. Who are they?
Us
Well, yes and no. The Church of Christ broke up, but this is the United Church of Christ. And there's such, Church of Christ and United Church of Christ is like the proverbial dogs and cats fighting. This is a very conservative organization that are very literalist, who, won't have pianos or organs in their worship. The United Church of Christ is the most liberal denomination, mainline Protestant denomination in America. I wasn't going to make fun of the Church of Christ, but something happened yesterday, I had to. This came in the mail to our house. And again, the Church of Christ is where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible's silent, we're silent. And since the New Testament doesn't say you can have musical instruments, they don't have them. This is from, I'm not going to say the name, of Church of Christ in Lee Summit. It's where my wife and I vote. You are invited to celebrate Easter with us. Join us for an Easter egg hunt extravaganza and get your picture taken with the Easter bunny. Now, I may be stupid. Where in the New Testament does it say you can have a visit from the Easter bunny to your church? That's okay, but having the piano in worship isn't. Anyway, I got to share this with the class. Anyway, you have the Church of Christ and the United Church of Christ. It is called the United Church of Christ because it's got so many components. You mentioned breaking off with the disciples. That is, remember we talked about Stone and Campbell united in 1832? There was a group of Stone's followers who said, we're not in on the union. We're going to have our own very little fellowship. It was called the Christian Connection. And so, in 1931, the Christian Connection merged with the Congregational Christian Church to be the Christian, basically it was congregational. Then at one point, the Evangelical and Reformed churches merged, I think in the 30s. And then in 1957, the ENR and the Christian Connection merged, and they became the United Church of Christ. So it's basically 4 different churches, hence the name United, that were established in 1957, about the same age as a lot of us. And they are very liberal. That's important to us because we share some of our ministries with them, not much. Our overseas ministries are done together. And some disciple pastors pastor UCC churches and vice versa. But when you see Church of Christ and United Church of Christ, you're talking about 2 whole, way different things. And that's hard to understand. There's one other thing about the Church of Christ. If you go by some churches, and they're usually in nice parts of town, it will say the First Congregational Church in big letters. Then if you look underneath, it says United Church of Christ. The Congregational Church, much more New England than here, but it was a very prestigious thing. Upper class went to the Congregational Church. So they all became one happy family in 1957. And they're glad to put UCC on their signboard, but we're still, first and foremost, the Congregational Church, member of the UCC. That's just, if you see Congregational Church, see if they do it that way. Anyway, so that's some of the nomenclature. Now, I want to talk about how the disciples of Christ work in the world today. When we talk about the Christian church, disciples of Christ, what nations are we talking about? The United States and Canada. That there are certainly other branches of the Reformation, the Stone Campbell movement, that are in other places. But when we talk about our denomination, it's simply in the U.S. and Canada. And anyway, I told you that in 1968 we officially became a denomination. And so we adopted a design. Now, if any of you have been been in other denominations. You know, like the Methodists have the Book of Order. And other the Episcopalians have the Book of Common Prayer, that are long books. This is all we got. This is printed one-sided. It's 20 pages and that's it. This talks about how the disciples of Christ work. And the one word I want you to remember today is manifestation. According to this, there are three manifestations of the Christian church. There is the general manifestation, Indianapolis, the regional manifestation, and then the local church. And the thing is that they're all three considered church. You are a member of Liberty Christian Church. You're a member of the Great Christian Church of Greater Kansas City, and you are a member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. They're all church. So let me talk about the biggest manifestation first, the general manifestation. Actually, I have to go back. One of the things it talks about in here are elders and deacons. This is very non-specific, but it does talk about each church having elders and deacons. Now, I want to talk about that for a minute. On a given Sunday morning in any disciple church, almost any, what is the most controversial thing that we do? What's the thing that would set other Christians on edge? Some people that would set on edge, yes, if you're Catholic, but almost all the mainline Protestant churches let anybody take communion.
Having lay people.
Absolutely. Having lay people preside at the Lord's table. And that is like, I'm going to share this story. I've got to clean it up a little. I was talking when I was pastoring to my best friend in Hiawatha, the pastor of the Presbyterian Church. And I was sharing that we let lay elders preside at the Lord's table. And I am not going to use the expression he used. But basically what he said is that, boy, you let lay people preside at the Lord's table, that's the ministerial equivalent of being castrated. That's actually the expression he used. That in so many churches, the ultimate, they walked through and just heard that. Come out here, Gary. I got to tell you, that's all you're going to remember about me. What I remember about this guy is when we were doing the HVAC renovation, you know what I'm going to say.
I do.
We were that the Campbell room apparently had an over-boosted air conditioning system. And we were sitting at the meeting, and Gary goes, you could hang meat in there. So anyway, now I know what you're going to remember about me. That's right. Anyway. So the idea that we let lay people preside at the Lord's table, I mean, usually, of course, it's elders. But technically, any member could, a 15-year-old could preside at the Lord's table. And in other denominations, that's shocking. And that's the most controversial thing we do. And it's funny that if our elders do more than elders in most denominations, our deacons do less. Now, in a Catholic church, it means something big to be a deacon. It's a man who has basically been set apart for ministry. They can perform marriages. They can do funerals. The only thing they can't do is mass. And but that's a lifetime thing. And you have a special uniform you wear. And if you're a deacon and you're married, that's fine. But if your wife dies, you can never get married again. So it's a big deal to be a deacon. And of course, in every Baptist church, who runs the church? The deacons. I remember somebody talking about it in a disciple church. It's like, well, they're a deacon and they just became a member. Is that uncommon in most disciple churches? No. I mean, we have like a 2-year waiting period here, but that's more than most. Basically, every able-bodied person over the age of 15 who's not an elder is probably a youth deacon, a a full deacon, a deacon emeritus, because that's simply, we have to have people to serve communion. I mean, obviously, in our COVID situation, it's different. But our elders do more than elders in other churches, and our deacons probably do less. Anyway, that's just a side note. There are 3 manifestations of the Christian church: the general, the regional, and the local. The general manifestation is Indianapolis. We have a General Assembly that meets every 2 years, odd-numbered years in various places. And it is both a mass meeting and a delegate assembly. How many delegates does Liberty Christian Church get? At least 2. Every church, if you've got 2 members, they're both delegates. Every church in the yearbook gets 2. And then it's per 100 people, you get 1 more authorized delegate. But that doesn't count your ministers, because typically the ministers ordained and commissioned are automatically voting members. And a lot of times, to be honest, the conventions, the pastor of the church goes, and there may often be only one other member of the church, layperson, who goes. Who is that usually? The minister's spouse. Oh. The minister. A lot of times it's the pastor and the pastor's spouse. Now, he or she has to be elected, but if there's only one person that wants to go, but there's a lot of ministers and minister spouses that show up at this. And they're the only ones who can vote. But, how many of you ever been to a General Assembly? Very good. So, they have an open mic session. Several, when there's a resolution come up, you can speak. Do you have to be a voting delegate to speak? No. And that's the interesting thing, that any member of the Disciples of Christ can come to the General Assembly and speak on the floor. Now, could that present problems? So, typically, how long is the average speaker allotted? 2 minutes. And if they go over, you know what happens? They turn the microphone off. And so it's interesting because it is in one sense a mass meeting that any disciples of Christ member can come and be in the assembly. They can't all, honestly, most of them are voters. But anybody can come and speak on the floor for 2 minutes. Now, at that assembly, every 6 years, we elect a person who's called general minister and president. Does anybody know who our current general minister and president is? Terry Hord Owens. She has been the president for about 4 to 5 years. It's a 6-year term. You can be reelected once. She is going to be put up for reelection again, I guess probably at the 23 assembly. And that's the person who is kind of the general pastor of the church. Now, the general minister gets a salary. But just like in our churches, we have the salaried people, our pastors, and then we have the unsalaried people like Roger and I and other people on the board. So there is at the general church. There's the general minister and president and the other people who run the denomination with who work for the church. There's also a moderator, a vice moderator, first vice moderator, or second vice moderator, who are either ministers or lay people who are volunteers who actually run the sessions. Again, it's like at a disciple church board meeting. Who runs a board meeting? Roger or Dave? Roger. And that's true in every disciple church. The business session occurred, it's not Terry Hord Owen who runs them. It's one of the moderators. So One
Are
of
they
the
people trying to become the president eventually? Like in a lot of organizations, you'll see people kind of work their way, like they're like on the second whatever, and then you're like working your way up to a presidency. So are those people that are moderating or whatever, or volunteering their time, are they trying to like eventually get to the presidency?
it's like, can a naturalized citizen become president of the United States? No, unless we amended the Constitution. It's written in here that the general minister and president has to be an ordained minister. So yes, if we amended this, they could. But the moderator, at least one of the three moderators has to be a minister. So your question is, are people trying to work their way up? Possibly. But there's usually lay people, and unless we change the rules, they can't become general minister and president. So, again, each manifestation of the church can take its own position. We talked before about the kinds of church governance. Episcopal with bishops, where the bishop says this is how it's going to be. We talked about congregational, where the congregation says this is how it's going to be. We talked about Presbyterian, where there's a presbytery of lay people and pastors who decide how it's going to be. What are we? We call ourselves covenantal, which is basically congregational. That when push comes to shove, if we don't like what the rest of the disciples are doing, we can do what we want. But in a covenantal form, it's like we're supposed to respect the region, they're supposed to respect us, the region's supposed to respect the general is supposed to respect the region. But that doesn't always happen. I mean, there have been regions known to have poached congregations in other regions. Now, that's not supposed to happen. And it may not happen anymore, but that happened at one time. The region that did that shall remain nameless. But the strange thing is that each manifestation, the general church, the regional church, and the local church, could take a different position on an issue. And the general manifestation tends to be far more liberal, progressive, whatever you want to call it, than the local churches. So sometimes they take a position and people in local churches are saying, what? We're not in favor of that. You don't have to be. The general manifestation speaks to the church but not for the church. It's like this. The next General Assembly, they could pass a resolution saying that Mars is inhabited by little green men. And the region could say, no, that's wrong. Everybody knows Mars is inhabited by little blue men. And at our board, we could say, no, Mars is inhabited by little purple men. Well, which is the position of the Christian church? At each level, you can take a different position. Now, obviously, that's a little silly, but that can be how it works. Now, there are a number of the general manifestation of the church. Most of the work is done by the general units, and this is kind of where the alphabet soup comes back in. There is the Christian Board of Publications, aka Chalice Press. There is the Christian Church Foundation that raises money. There is the Council on Christian Unity that is our ecumenical arm. There's the Disciple Church Extension Fund that helps new churches get started. There's DHM, Disciple Home Missions, that deals with stuff in the United States and Canada. There's the Disciples of Christ Historical Society, the Disciples Overseas Ministry, the Ministry of Higher Education, the National Benevolent Association, the other NBA, and finally the Pension Fund of the Christian Church, which has 14,000 members and manages $3 billion of assets. And interestingly, the pension fund is disciple, but it serves not just disciple, but Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ, and CCCC ministers. And I don't know how that came about, but they're always in their newsletters like, we're a disciple, but hey, everybody in the Stone Campbell movement is welcome to participate. We also have 3 offices for ethnic and racial groups. There is the National Convocation of the Christian Church, which deals with African American ministries. The North American Pacific Asian Disciples, aka NAPAD, that deals with Pacific and Asian disciples. And finally, there's a Pastoral Commission for Hispanic Ministries and Hispanic Caucuses. And finally, I couldn't mention, this is the Bible of the Christian Church, the yearbook and directory. There's up-to-date ones in there. You get one when you graduate from seminary, so this is the only one I own from 1983. It's like, okay, kid, you paid us thousands in tuition, here's your gift. So if you want to, this is interesting. If you're ever on a search committee and you want to know about a pastor, the way you find out is look them up in here, because you can look at every church they've ever been at. Take the yearbooks back and say, oh yeah, you did a great job here. You didn't do a great job here. But this can be an interesting tool. So, any questions on the general church? Now we're going to talk about the regional church. When I was in seminary, there were 38 regions. There are 31 now. We are in the greater Kansas City region, which is basically a few counties in Missouri and Kansas. We may be we have, last time I heard, 84 churches. It may have gone down, but we have 84 churches in these few counties. We are the smallest of all the geographic regions. What's the largest geographic region?
West.
What?
Like the West, like Montana up there, because they don't have a lot of people.
Think bigger than that. Canada. Canada is a huge country. It is one region with 17 churches in it. And so what goes between regions is like between churches. It's very different. I mean, the regional minister of Canada is got like churches in 5 provinces. And I mean, I'm sure her job is very different than Bill Roseheim's, who literally in an hour could drive to every one of his churches. And it's interesting that how the regions work are differently. The regional ministers talk more now than they used to. And they're not as homogeneous as they used to be. But every region ran differently. Now, I made the flippant remark last week that when I was ordained by the Christian Church in Mid-America, because GKC didn't exist yet, that it was a fairly lax process. I never met with the elders of my church. I sat down halfway through seminary and had an hour discussion with the regional minister. Near the end of seminary, I flew back from Fort Worth, drove down to Jeff City, and had a meeting for 1 hour with half the Committee on Ministry. A week later, I had a 30-minute discussion with the regional minister who told me, yes, we approved you to be ordained. And that was it. Basically, 2.5 hours of interaction in 3 years of seminary, and I'm ordained. Now, I am sure that in every region it's far more difficult, rigorous to get ordained than that. But even then, and this shows you the difference between regions. When I was at Bright Divinity School, kids from Kansas who wanted to be ordained by the Kansas region had to meet with the regional committee on the ministry every year. And the Christian church in Kansas, was some of those people believed, I think, that God actually lived on the campus of Phillips University. That the students from Bright had to drive up to Phillips in Enid to meet with the committee from Kansas every year. And from what at least one student from Kansas told me, it wasn't a pleasant experience. The Christian church in Ohio was more strict than that. They actually flew all their seminarians back to Ohio every year for a meeting. And your final, preordination visit wasn't like, my 1 hour in Jeff City, tell us about your life. They had 4 hours of being grilled. And so every region is different. In the Southwest region, Texas and New Mexico, everything is bigger in Texas, more money in Texas. Their district ministers They had over 400 churches in their region at one time. Their district ministers basically did what a regional minister did everywhere else, because simply the regional pastor was too busy. So regions vary, obviously, considerably. Who's our regional minister? Bill Rosheim, a wonderful man. When my last Sunday at Fairview, Bill was there, and I made the comment that there's one regional minister and there are 84 church. Well, there's another regional minister, but there's 84 churches in the region, and either Bill's lying to me about the number of churches or he has cloned himself, because I don't know how he could be everywhere for every church like he was for me and for Fairview. So he's quite a guy. So that's the regions. Well, we have a guest speaker today to talk about how Liberty Christian Church works. And rest assured, other disciple churches don't function like Liberty. But the expert is our friend, our board chair, elder, Dr. Roger Dusing, who helped write the bylaws, who's going to tell us how things work here. Roger?
Dr. Regas? I will not try to diagram anything. I will not look at John Madden play anything else. So the Liberty Christian Church is run by the board of the executive board. That is made up of 4 officers: the board chair, myself, the vice chair, Steve Regas, who will be the board chair next year, the secretary, Kitty Brinkman, and the treasurer is current Luann Key. So those are the 4 offices elected by the board each year for the following year. We're then made up of an odd mixture of 24 committees, yes, we still use the word committee, clumped into 8 ministries. So there's a lot of different things. Not all of those are populated at any given time, but that's the plan. We can start with the worship ministry. Worship ministry controls everything that happens in worship. So that includes the structure, the special worship services, and the serving. So one of the groups there are the serving teams. Hopefully all of you are one of those, to help figure out who's going to be the elder and deacon serving in any given weekend. Then we have the church life ministry team, headed by Sandy McCullough. The worship ministry, by the way, is headed by a combination of Cindy Ray and Susan Trotter. So Sandy is in charge of everything that goes on with the personal interactions between members and the church. So it's things like visitation, fellowship, member relations, church growth, all those kind of things live within the church life ministry. And we have the stewardship and finance ministry, headed by John Sprugel. That one's exactly like it sounds. It has everything to do with money. So the finance committee puts together the budget. They monitor that every month. The stewardship committee raises the money, hopefully to fund that budget. We have the spiritual education and development ministry, headed by Sarah Bauer. So this has everything to do with Christian education. So it's got the children's committee, the youth committee, and the adult committee, trying to make sure that we have curriculum in our Sunday school classes, and we have other gatherings that drive educational development. We have a communications and technology committee, ministry, headed by Brent Parsons. So everything between communication between the ministers and the pastors. So the communications committee, the social media team, and then the technology committee. So they're a group of folks that are driving the technology and the worship services. We have the planning and support ministries, headed by Gary Zaborak. This is kind of the back office for the church. Pastor Parish Personnel Ministry Committee, always fun. Leadership Development, CSAP, the Child Sexual Abuse Prevention, which new name is
Safe Spaces.
Safe Spaces, and the Bylaws Committee, always a fun one. So all that's planning support. We have the outreach services, outreach gifts and services. So anything that the church does outside of this, outside of the building, to reach outside. So that's Johnny's Cafe, the Wilkerson Food Pantry, Micah Ministries, our general giving, which goes to national, any special events, all happens within outreach gifts and services. And then we have the ever popular property committee. So we are fortunate enough to live in a 100-and-whatever-year-old building. The property committee maintains that property. So they're responsible for everything that happens within the facility itself, including the grounds. Then that board is also supported by ex officio members, which include the past chair of the board, which is Paul Bailey, our senior pastor, Dave Culver, our pastor for spiritual growth, Stephen Burr, our children's ministry transitional leader, Ms. Kelly Schneikart, newest member of the staff, and the renovation team, which is headed by Ryan Sprugel. So all of that, or is represented by Brian Sprugel, all of that is how we do the operations of the church, the business of the church. All of that in conjunction with the pastors. They're leading the spiritual side of it. And then on top of that, we have this organization called the Trust and the Trustees. So people give money to the church for other than specific reasons, then it goes into the trust fund. Trust fund is used to support the real property of the church. So that's what Hope's Fund, the ministries. We have a group of 4 trustees, Pam Strang, Gary McCullough, Paul Costello, and Karen Sprugel, who oversee the investments in the trust, manage the monthly or the semi-annual distributions, etc. Pam, how much do we have in the trust right now?
A little over $1 million.
So-
About $1.2 million.
So over the years, we've collected a good size of money. We would like more. Anybody want to do that? The trust fund also has a portion that's dedicated to ministers' housing. Back in the day, we owned a church parsonage that was sold. The proceeds went into the trust. The trust then is used to pay the current minister's housing allowance. And we have a trust dedicated specifically to the food pantry. I can't remember the lady's name.
Wilkerson.
Gave us, no, the one who gave us all the money.
Wilkerson.
It was her.
Yeah.
Made a bequest of $100,000 or more to help feed our feeding ministries. So the proceeds of that helped to fund Johnny's Cafe. So all in, I think that's it.
Thank you. So, and I realize I should have given him the mic, but you all heard him. That is how Liberty Christian Church works. Is that how any of the other 3,000 churches in the denomination work? No. In a sense, yes. They almost all have a general board. They have a board chair or moderator. They have elders and deacons. They have communion every Sunday. But other than that, they are all different. And if you've ever been to another disciple church, you know what I'm talking about. The most unusual thing about Liberty Christian Church, and I have never seen this anywhere else, we say, I think I've told you this before, the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Most disciple churches say debts and debtors. A few will say, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, which is probably the best theologically correct one. But we are an independent organization, and, you know, until Christ comes back, we can say trespasses and trespass against us, and nobody can stop us. As Roger talked about, he's the board chair this year, and I'll be the board chair next year. Is that normal in disciple churches? Yes and no. Usually the board chair, the vice chair becomes the board chair. But what is very unusual here is that it's only a one-year setup. Now, most disciple churches, this is a weird thing, they're one-year terms. But it's understood tacitly that you will serve 2 years. And you're elected 1 year, and then it's just, you know, divine right, you get a second year. And the church, Fairview, the church I grew up in, 1 year, the guy was up for a second year, and people didn't like him, and you're not going to get your second year. At which point he resigned during worship service and walked out. So, but that's... Every church is different. Now, you talk about, we have 10 people on our board, roughly 10. Now, there's always a board, but how it's elected, how it's set up is very different. The traditional pattern, which I should add was idiotic, was back in the old days that every elder, every deacon, and every deaconess, that's when we still had separate men and women, every one of those people was on the board, which is most of the church. Now, do you remember boards that work that way? Very cumbersome. And the worst part about it was, if you have a board with 70 people, what are the chances you're going to have at least one kook? Seriously. That one person can raise heck in the board meeting. And if there's a second one, then they can have a motion and a second. I mean, when I was pastor at Hiawatha, I mean, I thought we were going to lose somebody over this, but a motion was made and there was no second given. And I'm surprised that the guy who made the motion didn't walk out. But that was a church where every elder, every deacon, every deaconess, and who knows who else was on the board. That was a very unwieldy scheme. And so most churches have gone beyond that now and got smaller boards. We have 10, which is very small. At Fairview, it was about 24. It was the committee chairs, the chairs of the board, and then there were like 3 elder representatives, 3 deacon representatives. There was somebody from Christian Men's Fellowship, somebody from Christian Women's Fellowship. The emeriti officers had somebody. At Countryside, it was probably around 30, but there was so much stuff that happened at every meeting that literally each of the committee chairs could only give a verbal report every other meeting because we didn't have time. Now, at Countryside, at Liberty, we take communion during board meetings, but that's not always been the case at Liberty, has it? It kind of depends on the board chair. At Fairview, we didn't. At Hiawatha, we didn't. In my student church at Comanche, we didn't. That church, we'd have Good Sunday 20, and we had 8 board members. and they were not afraid of meeting when the student pastor was back in Fort Worth. And it was funny that the first Sunday I was hired, it's like the board chair's wife said, "We run the church." And they did. But I was the student. That was fine. That was fine that they ran the church and gave me total freedom to preach. Again, communion. Have you ever been in a disciple church that serves communion exactly like another? No. I mean, we all have communion every Sunday, but it's different. You know, now we have 1 elder there. We used to have, at the formal service we had 2, and at the early service we had 1. Now, when I was at Countryside, where Sean and I met, they had an unusual situation that there were 2 elders at every service. One would give the meditation, and the other would give the prayer. Now, when we're down in Columbia visiting our niece, we go to the Christian church there, and they do something I've never seen. There's 2 elders. One gives the offering prayer behind the table. The other gives a communion prayer. And it's just different in every church. Do you take the elements when they pass by? Do you take the elements simultaneously? Or my favorite is that communion is both a corporate act and an individual act. What I used to like was when you took the bread when it passed by and then everybody held the cup and took it together. Obviously, in the new normal of the world of COVID, all that's changed. I doubt we ever see intinction again. But communion in every church is different. And it's interesting, of course, do we have to be in church to take communion? Have you ever been on a retreat? People take communion. Have you ever been on a youth retreat? You know, you have kids presiding at communion. I tell a story that we're so free in communion. When Sean and I got married, it was in a Presbyterian church. And we wanted to have communion. But they're far more strict, so they had to take it to the session to vote on to allow us to have communion at our wedding. You mentioned the Board of Trustees. And in this church, the Board of Trustees, as far as I know, only controls the trust fund.
Correct.
Now, in other churches, that's different. At Fairview, there were, I think, 3 trustees. They controlled the endowment money. They also controlled the insurance. And, of course, insurance covers a lot of things. So our trustees were all part of our COVID team because they were the ones that had the final say on the building. At Countryside, one of the trustees, who was also an attorney, always used to say, the board controls the spiritual life of the church, we control the temporal life of the church. And he would always add, yeah, if we wanted to sell the building, we could. Not that they ever did, but for some reason he liked to remind us that they could do that. Some churches don't have trustees. It's all individual. Any questions? The final thing I want to talk about is, I told you the story last week when we officially became a denomination in 1968. And there were like 7,000 disciple churches, 4,000 of which were the brotherhood, and 3,000 of which were the loyal. And the brotherhood were the people who actually cooperated. The loyal were the hangers-oners who were disciple in name only. So when 68 came, and restructure happened, we became a denomination. There was a group of people who became the CCCC, remember the rumor they spread? If you don't leave, Indianapolis will take your property. If you don't leave now, there's never another chance, because we'll be like the Catholics. They'll own your building. Did that scare campaign work? You better believe it. To the tune of 2,300 churches left in 1 year. So the question is, who owns our property? Every disciple church owns its property, but caveat. This church was founded in 37 or 38? 37. And, you know, it's not like Fairview, who still has a charter member. I was telling somebody, actually it was Ryan Baxter. We're having lunch when I was at Fairview, and I go, yeah, I got to talk to a charter member yesterday. And of course, he goes, well, how did you do that? Obviously, Dave has never done that. And there's actually one charter member of Fairview left. And where was I at? When we built our structure, you financed the building yourself. But that isn't easy. And a lot of times, secular lenders don't want to lend money to a church for a whole lot of reasons. And so in the late 1800s, the Church Extension Fund came about. And as we talked about, I think it was last week, it's oftentimes the money comes from individuals who put money in. They have their 401ks in them, whatever. And that money is invested in new churches. Now, so all churches own their property. And if you wanted to leave, you could leave the denomination. But there are a couple of caveats. Until you pay off your home, who's carrying the title? The bank. When you borrow money to build a new building from the church extension, who's keeping the title? Indianapolis, the lender. Which I forget, it may actually, the Board of Church Extension, I forgot it's in Indianapolis or St. Louis. It used to be Kansas City a long time ago. So if a church that still owes money on their building wants to say, we don't want to be disciple anymore, they have a problem. And I suppose they could refinance with a secular lender and leave. But there are other reasons why a church may not have control of its property. In the business world, have you ever heard of the poison pill strategy? It's if a company is facing a hostile takeover, they'll get a situation set up that makes taking them over so undesirable that nobody will want to do it. Now, if you think about Disciples of Christ churches, after the Second World War, there were a lot of, you just think about the suburbs in the Northland, there were a number of large, beautiful facilities built. And in 2022, there's a lot of large, beautiful, in many cases well-kept facilities that are just about empty. If, a church that has 50 or 60 in worship, if another church wanted to move in and take over, would it be that difficult? No. And so certainly some of this came back from the era of independence versus disciple. Some churches have adopted the poison pill strategy in saying, we will literally give our church to the region, not because we don't want to have control, but simply we don't want outsiders coming in, taking this and taking it out of the disciples of Christ. There's one other case where there's a question about who owns the building. Now, again, this is a moot point at Liberty. But have any of you worked on new church developments for the region? Now, is land in the suburbs cheap? No. Where do you typically build new churches? In growing areas. And what usually happens is the region will buy and gift to the congregation their land site with one hitch. This is given for you to be a Disciples of Christ church. Now the question comes 50 years later. You bought your building, you paid your building off, and you decide you don't want to be a disciple. So you own the building, but the property, the land. What do you do? Now I've been told in our region it's basically if you want to go away, you can walk. But again, there's 30 other regions, and that's up to them. But the converse is also true. You were talking about how old our building is. And if any of you have been on the board of the property ministry, it takes a lot to keep this place up. We have the resources and people to do it. But there are lots of little churches in small towns in the city that have buildings, maybe not quite as old as ours, but old. And who simply, it's like any organization or your own household. If the money gets tight, what do you defer first? Maintenance. There are lots of old churches with tremendous amounts of deferred maintenance and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller congregations. Well, eventually they fold. Well, what happens to the building if they can't sell it? Surprise, regional minister, guess what you got? A building, an old building. And that's one of the things that the region has to deal with. What do we do with these old properties, often not maintained well? You know, what else can you do with a 100-year-old church than be a church? I mean, sometimes you can sell them to other churches, but sometimes they have to get creative. So every disciple church owns its own property. But walking away from the disciple, certainly if you're owe Indianapolis money, that ain't going to happen. Any questions so far? I'll see you next week. It's the last session. Thank you.